Papers. If many of that opinion say aye. Contrary, no. Ayes have it.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
Question is that this House do now adjourn. Andrew Weston.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And continuing a trend, I'm delighted to have secured this debate on post office services in isolated communities. It is an issue that is very important to me and to many of my constituents. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, you may not think that a Member of Parliament who represents Stretford and Urmston, a seat relatively close to central Manchester, would be interested in post office services in isolated communities. But a key point that I would want to make today is that you don't have to be rural to be isolated, and that post office services are just as important to isolated communities in city regions as they are to those in the countryside. That's why it is so important that the right support is in place for them to stay open and to thrive. This brings me on to Partington, in my constituency, which has now been without a post office since August last year, when its long-serving postmistress retired. This has had a significant impact on many of my constituents, because while Partington is a great place to live and an area that I am very proud to serve, there is no doubt that it is an isolated community. Transport connectivity is abysmal. There are no rail or light rail links. Bus services are infrequent, to say the least, and there are low levels of car ownership. What's more, its town centre banks have long since closed. In other words, the array of services that Partington Post Office used to provide, such as banking facilities, collecting or delivering mail, the ability to pay bills, are now incredibly difficult for residents in Partington to access. Good point.
And I commend them, and it's coincidental that the Honourable Gentleman's adjournment debate follows a very significant debate in the post office as well. As a member may have heard in the previous debate, post offices are a vital tool in combating rural isolation, as he rightly said. Does the Honourable Member not agree that there must be a statutory obligation, I believe, to rural-proof post office provision to ensure that whilst the banks have abandoned communities like the Honourable Gentleman referred to without fear or favour, the post offices have a responsibility, and we must ensure that that responsibility is fulfilled and also delivered?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention. He is absolutely correct, and in fairness, there is a government grant to support the subsidisation of post office services in isolated and rural communities. There is, however, a question of whether that grant is sufficient enough, or indeed if it is reaching the right places, because returning to the people of Partington, Mr Deputy Speaker, their nearest post office is now several miles away, or for those without transport, a lengthy round trip that is prohibitively expensive for many local residents. People in Partington are now in the 1% of post office customers in the country whose nearest branch is more than 3 miles away. I will give way.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank my honourable friend for giving way. It is clear that the post office treatment of communities and isolated post offices is increasingly poor. But a number in my own constituencies he's described, most recent 3 actually, in Treharris, in Derry, and next week post office in Pantscatlock in Merthyr Tydfil will be closing temporarily, but albeit, as we know, without a full consultation. Those closures are usually permanent. But does he agree in terms of the access to post offices, the 3 miles that he mentioned there, for communities where they're geographically isolated, where transport is poor, where people have mobility issues, elderly people, the post office is really placing their services out of reach of people in those communities?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. Partington's nearest recommended post office site, as advised by the post office, is 3.9 miles away, and whilst that is a significant distance in and of itself, it actually is a post office within a local co-op store, and when residents try to access the full range of services at that locality, they are unable to do so, and they have to travel even further into Urmston town centre. So having these services in local communities is incredibly important, and my honourable friend is particularly right to highlight that once they are gone, they very often do not return. But like my honourable friend, it is not just one example from my constituency where a post office has closed recently, because the Woods End post office in my constituency also has been closed since summer of last year, and the loss of 2 post office branches locally within a period of a few months gives an insight, as does my honourable friend's example of 3 in his own constituency, at the scale of this challenge nationally, where we know that many branches, particularly those in isolated communities, are struggling. As well as losing access to vital banking and postal services, people in Partington and Woods End have lost something else, a community hub that was an important asset to both areas, because, as I know the Minister recognises, the value of post offices goes beyond the provision of mere services. They can be places that contribute to tackling loneliness, that prevent older or more vulnerable people from becoming digitally excluded, and where close and trusting relationships are built between staff and customers. Indeed, research from the post office itself shows that 3 in 4 people who use branch services list face-to-face interaction as the main reason for them choosing to do so. Mr Deputy Speaker, in preparation for this debate, I reached out to residents in Partington and around Woods End and asked them to contact my office to share the impact that their post office closing has had on them. I'm grateful to everybody who did, and I will share a snapshot of their experiences. One resident, aged 77, told my team that conversations with post office staff was the only human interaction he had. If losing this wasn't bad enough, the gentleman in question then had to start relying on Partington's one ATM machine to access cash. He was recently mugged just after using the machine, because criminals know now that vulnerable people have no other place in Partington to withdraw cash. He's understandably now scared to use the machine again, and instead has to rely on a friend to drive him to the closest post office several miles away. Another resident, aged 89, described the loss of the post office as devastating to her independence, and explained how in the past she used to walk to her local branch, but now her family must travel from Oldham in the north of Greater Manchester to drive her all the way to Sale post office for her to access the services she needs. Her family's journey will take upwards of 2.5 hours to complete on a good day. I have another constituent who's now spending £20 per week on taxis to go to her nearest post office following the closure of her local branch on Woods End Road. This is unacceptable, not least because those most affected are often pensioners and therefore necessarily on fixed incomes. I have written to the post office about both branch closures in my constituency on multiple occasions to try and find a resolution. With both branches, I think the post office could have been better prepared in terms of recruiting a new postmaster to run the branch and in terms of providing some sort of alternative provision in the short term. Indeed, in Partington's case, the postmistress gave the post office 3 years' notice of her impending retirement, yet we find ourselves in the unacceptable situation that we are in now. I am still awaiting news of whether a mobile or drop and collect service could be put in place as a temporary measure to provide residents with access to post office services whilst a longer-term solution is sought, something that I had to request and which had not seemingly been proactively considered by the post office. Now, I understand from the post office that recruiting new postmasters can be challenging, and this represents a broader issue nationally about the viability of branches in isolated communities and the remuneration of the people running them. This brings me to the support that post offices need. Like any other retailer, post office branches are facing the challenge of declining footfall as more and more people go online for services. This, of course, makes the host shops that post offices often operate out of less commercially viable. We should also reflect on the provision of government services through post offices, which have declined by over 75% since 2010 and today make up only 4% of their overall revenue. In March 2024, I believe the government is also set to withdraw its DVLA services from post offices. And then there's the relationship between banks and post offices, with high street banks, including those in Partington, closing en masse in recent years. Post offices have increasingly had to step in to provide banking services in communities. The 5,500 bank closures since 2015 have saved those banks somewhere in the region of £2.5 to £3 billion a year. And there is a strong case, as I know the Minister himself has articulated previously, for some of this money to be redirected to support the post office network. So when the Minister responds, I'd be grateful if he could update as to whether there's been any progress in talking to the banks about them potentially providing some revenue to support post office services. I know that one of my local post offices, Stretford, hosts pop-up banks on a regular basis, and that is a town centre that is to lose one of its banks in the near future also. But last but by no means least, there is the big issue that the cost of sustaining the loss-making post office network is significantly greater than the £50 million in annual network subsidy that the post office receives from the government, as I highlighted earlier in my response to the honourable member for Strangford. As the post office themselves have said, while pressures on branches in isolated communities have increased, the subsidy the government has in place to support them has not reflected this. In fact, my understanding is that the subsidy has declined over the past decade from £210 million in 2012 to £50 million per year in recent years. So I wonder if the Minister could assure me that the £50 million subsidy and/or other forms of financial support is available to post office services in places such as Partington, which, while they may not be rural, are certainly isolated. I understand if the money has been reduced that there is less to go around, and it would be reassuring to know that somewhere such as this would be eligible. Now, the previous postmistress was not accessing this grant in order to run her post office, but the difficulties in attracting a new postmaster to run the service suggest that this may be something that should be considered moving forward. I would be incredibly grateful if I could ask the Minister for his support in working with the Post Office to try and establish this, and to look at any way we can to restore post office services both on Woodsend Road and in particular in Partington in my constituency. And to conclude, Mr Deputy Speaker, I hope that today I have highlighted the importance of post offices to isolated communities, particularly those such as Partington, but also those highlighted by my honourable friend and the honourable member for Strangford. When residents lose these services, it can be truly devastating. They often support incredibly vulnerable customers, and I want to thank again everybody affected by the post office closures in Partington and Woodsend who took the time to contact me and share their stories. I'm pleased the Minister has had the chance to hear them today, and I hope that they will help him push for the changes needed to support our post office network moving forward and ensure those services are retained in isolated communities. Minister, Kevin Hollinrake.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I congratulate the honourable gentleman for securing this very important debate. It's a debate on a subject that's very close to my heart as well, as a representative of a rural seat in terms of Thirsk and Malton. I think we all know how highly valued post offices are to our communities, and the deep concern our constituents have whenever these are closed, even temporarily. Obviously that's due to the services they provide, but also, as he puts it, the fact that they are the provider of trusted relationships, and I couldn't agree more with that particular point. It is still a very significant network, of course, 11,500 branches across the country. Recent research by the London School of Economics highlighted that post office the network makes a very valuable contribution to the economic health of our high streets. £33.1 billion of additional spending every year as a result of our post office network. It's therefore very understandable that the honourable member would want to bring this issue to a debate, given that his constituency, has seen changes in its provision of post offices in recent months, and indeed years, as he puts it. To be clear, the organisation, the Post Office, has the commercial freedom to deliver the branch network within the parameters set for it by government. by setting minimum access criteria and minimum services to be provided at branches across the country. For example, 99% of the population must live within 3 miles of the nearest branch, and in his constituency, 95%, because it being an urban constituency, 95% of the total urban population must live within 1 mile of their nearest outlet. It is pleasing that despite all the challenges faced by retailers in recent years, Post Office meets and exceeds these access criteria at a national level. In fact, more post offices have opened this year than have closed, and the network is as large today as it's been for 5 years, with around 11,700 branches open. In terms of the network of the post offices in Stretford and Urmston, as the Honourable Member will know, there are 12 branches operating in his area, serving around 13,000 customers every week. The post office network in his area supports around 60 full-time equivalent jobs and has an economic contribution of over £6 million each year to his constituency, as well as driving an additional wider high street spend of £5 million per year. I'm aware of the Honourable Member's concerns around the situation in Partington, where I understand the post office branch, as he said, closed last year when the postmistress retired after an incredible 35 years serving her community. From my own constituency experience, I fully appreciate the impact a branch closure can have on communities. It can be disruptive, particularly for communities who don't have nearby alternatives, but this fluctuation is part of the modern, dynamic, franchise-led business that the post office primarily is. The network is made up of small businesses, and just like any other franchise-based business, post offices can't necessarily control its franchisees' decisions about their future. As postmasters move on, branches close and new ones open, as he has experienced firsthand with the opening of Stretford Post Office in its new permanent location late last year. The reasons for a temporary branch closure, of course, are generally outside the control of the Post Office. However, in such instances, the Post Office ensures services are maintained as quickly as it can. I understand from the Post Office there is interest from a community group in taking on the Partington branch, with a further meeting scheduled next week. So I'm hopeful that the branch can be reopened as soon as possible. I note his points about a mobile service. I'm happy to take that away and update him in terms of the provision of a mobile service. They're not easy to secure, as I've experienced myself, but we'll do whatever we can. We're not blind to the realities of taking on and running a post office. Like any other retailer, post offices are facing pressures from continually evolving consumer behaviours, particularly as consumers shop online more, driving footfall away from the high street, and indeed in terms of consumer habits, in terms of things like accessing government services. We don't think it's our place to dictate to people where they should access those services, and I think we all like to access those services, often in an online environment. But nevertheless, we're keen to retain what services we can. He did point to the DVLA contract, which has been extended another year. I think everybody would like to see that extended on a longer-term basis, but clearly negotiations will continue. The changes in consumer behaviour are, of course, driving down the numbers of letters sent to a significant degree also, which is having an impact upon post offices. But there are reasons to be optimistic. We were very pleased to see the Post Office launch their parcels online business last year, where customers can select and pay for every and DPD products online before dropping off parcels at their nearest post office. It's also now rolling out a similar proposition across the physical network, meaning that customers can compare different carriers to choose the option that's best suits their needs. We see this as a very significant opportunity to improve competitiveness and competition in this market, and I'm keen to see Post Office expand this proposition further to include more carriers. There's also a major opportunity, as he puts it, in banking services. All customers, wherever they live, should have appropriate access to banking and cash services, and that's why we've legislated for access to cash to make sure that is the case and that customers can continue to access everyday banking services at the Post Office. This is important in his constituency. For example, around 50% of bank branches in Stretford and Urmston have closed since 2015, so post offices are key in providing access to cash in the constituency, as they are across the country. In December, a total of £3.38 billion in cash was either deposited or withdrawn across the country. The post office network is therefore a crucial component of this country's long-term provision of cash and banking services. And that's why, as he says, I've been very clear that the Post Office should be ambitious in their negotiations with the banks for the next iteration of the banking framework that already does provide significant revenue into the Post Office network, which we welcome, but there are further opportunities to do that. In terms of his particular issue, he may want to speak to the Economic Secretary of the Treasury in terms of potential other services such as banking hubs. As I said earlier, there are 30 around the country already, 70 more in the pipeline, and we've got an aspiration to get around 500 around the country, and maybe that is a suitable thing that might be provided in his constituency. Very happy to give way.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the Minister for giving way. I fully accept that there are challenges, and I think in many of our post offices we've seen people serving for many, many years, and when they do come to retirement, it really is a challenge then sometimes to get people to sort of take on those businesses. But in communities like we've described this afternoon, where they are isolated geographically or otherwise, public transport issues, and you have a lot of older people who sometimes use the cash for their transactions. I think banking hubs are great in larger towns perhaps, but in smaller isolated communities it's much more difficult. So just to ask the Minister, what other sort of options can be considered so that those communities don't become financial deserts?
That raises a very important point. Banking hubs are not a one-size-fits-all solution. There are other solutions, some of which are facilitated by the banking framework. Enhanced facilities in post offices, for example, one of them. A separate line, for example, in post office. Smart ATMs are a part of a solution here. There's some one banks which provide a mini banking solution that can be provided in libraries, for example. So there are a number of different solutions, and a number of different financial organisations, such as some of the building societies, are rolling out those kind of provisions. So there are a number of different solutions here, but we do see banking services and the remuneration that flows from that as being critical to make sure we have a sustainable network of post offices going forward. So any of his particular case, I've always been very clear in this House, any particular issues any members have, particularly local issues, I'm very happy to work with them, the relevant members and the post office, to try and deliver solutions on a case-by-case basis. Clearly, those opportunities do not mean that we are out of the woods, and branch profitability is a top priority for postmasters, and I'm very keen to make sure that profitability can be enhanced wherever possible. Finally, can I assure members that we remain steadfast in our support for the network? We have provided significant financial support to sustain the nationwide network. Over £2.5 billion in funding to support the Post Office network in the past decade alone, and we're providing a further £588 million for the Post Office between 2022 and 2025. These monies include investment, but also an annual network subsidy, as the Honourable Gentleman refers to, of £50 million, which helps to safeguard services in the uncommercial parts of the network. Government has been clear that the Post Office should be a valuable social and economic asset for communities and businesses for years to come. We continue to work with the Post Office to ensure the organisation and the network are fit for the future, and we always welcome views such as those expressed today on the network. Mr Deputy Speaker, therefore I close by thanking the Honourable Member for tabling this important debate and the other member who contributed in this debate.
Question is that this House to stand adjourned. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. The ayes have it. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.